The 30s in Australia were hard years. But by 1939, people were saying we were about to start a new period of prosperity and development. We had a heat wave. But that didn't stop Don Bradman hitting up 6 centuries on end. The hot weather was fine for the surf carnivals, too. Maroubra won the march past, again. In fact, all our champions were in form. Take the races. Ajax had been the favourite the year before. Now he piled up 18 wins on end. Quist and Bromwich were the young tennis stars. Yes, life was settling down again into a pattern. That was how we liked it. No surprises. Even the boat race. Shaw won it again, 3rd year on end. Europe was a long way away. We didn't want to be concerned with Hitler and his Nazis.
It is my melancholy duty to inform you officially.
We didn't want to be concerned, but in the end we had to, whether we liked it or not. Some came looking for adventure to escape the boredom of a humdrum life, but many more left jobs, families, security behind to answer their country's call. They put their ages back or forward, said they were out of work when they were in restricted occupations. Their eagerness broke through official barriers and public indifference. In this way, a remarkable force was created. One with enough potential officers in its ranks of 20,000 to staff a force 5 times that size.
I can't say I enjoyed my first weeks in the army. You see, coming from the militia, I knew how things ought to be run, and I told them so. I finished up training a whole platoon of raw recruits single-handed.
2 months after I joined up, they decided to march us through Sydney. We didn't expect much of a welcome, so we set out to make some people eat their words. I don't know who got the biggest surprise, them or us.
I always reckon that day turned me into a soldier. Just in time, I might add. 5 days later, we began embarking.
It was supposed to be our secret, our going away. Secret?
On the morning of the 10th of January 1940, 4 liners left Sydney, carrying with them 6,600 men of the 2nd AIF. Led by 1 warship and with another on either flank, the convoy began its journey to the other side of the globe.
On board, we tried to keep busy all the time. It helped to stop you thinking what those warships were there for. We weren't supposed to know where we were going, but the Germans evidently didn't know that. They announced it was Suez on the radio. They were right, too.
We really didn't feel we'd left Australia until we arrived, and suddenly we were foreigners. That was the very first time I felt homesick.
And so, for the 2nd time in history, an Australian force entered Palestine. After landing at Kantara, they travelled across Egypt to the camp waiting for them at Julis. They found bare tents pitched on muddy ground, but they quickly set to work improving conditions before the final training started. They trained under the wintry sky and on through the intense heat of the desert summer. They longed for action and felt ready for it. But the training went on until they ached physically and mentally for something to release the tension they'd built up. Then, after 9 long months, they got it in Libya against the Italian army. All their training had been building up to this moment. Everything as they'd practiced it, except that they'd never done it in combat before.
We saw plenty of Italian dead at Bardia and Tobruk. We left plenty of our own mates there, too. Of course, they were wounded from both sides.
For days, the wounded seemed to pour in, and all the time a dust storm was blowing. Filthy yellow grit that got in their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. Made it all so much worse.
They say a civilian never really becomes a soldier until he's come through combat for the first time. Well, we made it, some of us. But we'll never be quite the same again.
In March 1941, an emergency force consisting of British, New Zealand, Australian and Polish troops was hurriedly dispatched from Alexandria to Greece. Italy had attacked Greece without provocation the year before, and now Germany was massing her forces in Bulgaria, ready to advance.
We knew before we ever put troops into Greece that the operation would be extremely hazardous, to say the least. But spirits were high as we moved north in the spring sunshine. The Germans were better trained than us, and there were many more of them. And those of us who knew this and knew the weakness of defensive positions and communications and the relative lack of aircraft defences and air power were gravely concerned. Within 2 weeks, we knew the position was hopeless, and there was nothing to do but pull out. They got as many of us away as possible, but even so, 2,000 Australians were taken prisoner. Some of us were taken from Greece to Crete, where we fought and were again defeated. But the lucky ones came straight back to Egypt.
Even the trip back was a nightmare. We'd slept on deck with our rifles beside us all the time to shoot at the dive bombers. By the time we got to Alexandria, we'd had it.
In the middle of the year, Australia took part in a brief but bitterly fought campaign in Syria against the pro-German Vichy French, a tragic campaign waged against former allies. The Vichy French capitulated in July after the capture of Damour. Meanwhile, the face of the enemy had changed. Angered at the failure of the Italians, Hitler sent powerful German forces to Tripoli, known as the Afrika Korps, their proud commander, Rommel. This was the enemy, highly trained and professional. They appeared cold, ruthless, and very different from the good-humored and informal Australians. Yet each recognized in the other qualities which, if not envied, were at least respected. These were the men whose armored might was to force the Allies back across North Africa from the point they had reached well beyond Benghazi, right back until a stand was made at Tobruk. In a small area surrounding Tobruk Harbour, 24,000 troops were standing firm. The perimeter was a semicircle 22 miles long, and all along it, men dug themselves into the earth and clung there. Makeshift and invention were the standing rules. Within the besieged area, supplies were running out. The harbour was cluttered with bombed hulks. Unable to move them, the troops had to unload what supplies got to them over the top. Holding the siege meant almost never-ending work for every man.
We washed our clothes in salt water, as well as we could.
Men who had stood to all night slept if they could in the heat of the day.
Self-supporting prisoners, the German radio called us. The rats who lived in holes in the ground. We rather liked that.
The food came out of tins and we flavored it with vitamin pills. When they had us completely surrounded, water and rations were cut another 50%.
Day and night, Rommel continued to pound us with his artillery. We replied with everything we had. Even some pretty useless guns we'd captured from the Italians.
Rommel did his worst, and the defense of Tobruk remained unbroken. He tried to batter and starve us into submission, but we held out, and in the end it wasn't us who cracked. It was them.
When it was over, many of the survivors were in severe shock, some completely deaf from the never-ending barrage. With light hearts, they left Tobruk, but they carried with them the inevitable scars of 8 long months of privation and strain. After retraining in Palestine and Syria, some men remained to take part in the great breakthrough at Alamein. The rest of the troops left the Middle East to take up the struggle on a new front, the Pacific.
Going back was a bit different to going over. We used to laugh and horse about a lot on the way over. Of course, we were different too, I suppose. When we got the news about Singapore, I reckon we had a pretty fair idea of what those poor devils were going through.
Just 2 days before the final relief of Tobruk in December 1941, 17 aircraft had flown over one of the islands of Malaya. The bombs they dropped announced to the citizens of Singapore and the world that a new enemy, Japan, had entered the war. They'd been expecting it for nearly a year. British, Indian, and Australian troops had gone there to prepare for Malaya's defense. These troops were different from the eager young men who'd left at adventure in '39. Many of them were middle-aged men who'd left their homes because they felt they had a job to do. Many more were boys straight from school. None had any combat experience. Suddenly, they were thrown against a ruthless enemy, the experienced elite of the Japanese army.
It   was  a  very difficult situation. 'Cause 'we were 'very young. 'We were 'very 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 '
Japanese had almost unchallenged mastery of the air. Their southward advance was swift and bewildering. By February, just 10 weeks after the first attack, the so-called fortress of Singapore was ablaze. When Singapore surrendered, 22,000 Australians passed into Japanese hands. The men who poured into prison camp were exhausted, depressed, bewildered. As many as 1,000 of them were housed in quarters intended for 120. Bombing had destroyed the sanitary system, dysentery spread quickly, and cholera broke out. Nearly everyone had malaria as well. Improvised medical resources could not stem the tides of disease and death. Their captivity lasted 3.5 years, and 8,000 men, more than a third of all prisoners taken, died. Meanwhile, Australia was preparing to fight a war on her own doorstep. Part of our militia had been in New Guinea already on garrison. Now, thousands of troops were landed at Port Moresby with all possible speed.
It was everybody's war now. The Japs were too close for any messing about.
The Allies had decided on a policy of beat Hitler first, so the war against Japan had to take second place in global strategy. To fight this holding war in New Guinea, Australia had to strain her resources to the limit and beyond.
The Japanese had landed in the north and begun to move south across the mountains of the Owen Stanley Range. If they reached Moresby, Australia was only a stone's throw away, so we knew we had to stop them, or else.
I went forward with them as a cameraman. They were mostly young men, but their faces were old, with the grim look of men going once again into battle.
Cop this track report. Quote, not to be used by Europeans carrying loads. Natives must not carry more than 15 pounds. Huh, we carried up to 70 pounds.
We hauled 25-pounders up that impossible track. Once it took us 12 hours to cover 9 miles.
The greatest single problem in this campaign was supply. Native carriers and the soldiers themselves carried in heavy loads, but they relied on supplies from the air to keep them going. There were never enough aircraft, and pilots had difficulty locating dropping areas. Sometimes supplies dropped where they were needed, but often they were lost in the undergrowth or damaged beyond use on hitting the ground.
After lots of patrols, we were too tired to eat much, which is just as well, because there wasn't much to eat.
Up and down, up and down. As we went forward, we passed the native stretcher bearers bringing the wounded back. Oh, well, at least we wouldn't have to walk back. Like meeting your future face to face.
In the pictures I took, I tried to show the stamina and endurance that campaign called for. I used to write the captions, too. But sometimes words weren't necessary.
It rained and it rained until I thought the whole stinking island would be washed into the sea. But the boys carried on just the same.
We set up makeshift dressing stations as close as we could to the front line, but the fighting was so spread out, it was impossible to be everywhere we were needed. I don't know to this day how we saved as many lives as we did. Look, some of them were suffering from vitamin deficiency to start off with, plus a dose of malaria or dysentery, and frequently both. And then they got wounded on top of that. Well, the human body can take just so much.
The worst cases we sent back to base hospital. I doubt if some of them ever made a full recovery.
A lot of them had come from Boona and Gona, where they were fighting in sago swamps most of the time. Even before they were wounded, the climate, that awful humidity, had weakened them badly. The worst part was that we all knew as we worked to get them back on their feet that what we were really doing was getting them ready to go back and fight, all over again.
They wanted to get us into the Markham Valley, but the Japs had control of Leh and Salamoa, and there seemed to be no other way in. Then somebody got a bright idea.
The Yanks who were with us reckoned they'd spent 8 months training for something like this. But most of us had never even made one practice jump before. When it came to the point, I forgot all the instructions. I simply crossed my fingers and jumped.
There'd never been a campaign like this before. Jungle warfare stands every rule of battle on its head. We'd found that out pretty quickly and paid dearly for the mistakes we'd made. But now we knew enough to invent new rules. The right ones this time.
By the time we got to Shaggy Ridge, we too knew our way about in the jungle. We ought to. Some of us had been fighting in it for more than a year. And however much we hated it, however exhausted we were by the appalling conditions, we knew what we were doing. We could match the Jap, trick for trick, cunning for cunning. At last, the odds were evening up.
Each of them carried his own supply of ammunition and some rations. They were an army of individuals. They trained their bushmen's eyes to see things in a very different landscape.
We listened while a barrage of mortars and mountain guns softened them up first. And as soon as that finished, we moved in.
When you fought well, you were rewarded with another battle, until you got to feel you'd been in that stinking green hell your whole lifetime. You fought the Jap, sure, but you also fought malaria and dysentery and malnutrition. You fought the rain and the mud and the wet. You fought the heat. You fought the cold. You fought your feet, red, raw, and swollen white. You fought your body, weeping with tropical ulcers. Every ridge you took was a bitter battle. And then there was another ridge, and another, and another.
Milne Bay, Bougainville, Wow, Salamoa, Leh. Was this what you had to go on doing all your life? Did you have to fight like this right across the world until you beat them?
Blessed be the name of the Lord. We cherish his memory here. We commend his spirit to God who gave it and consigned his body to the earth.
Ever since August 1942, jungle training schools had been established in the hills and gullies of Queensland. It was to these, when they left the Middle East in April 1943, that troops were sent to prepare for their service in New Guinea. Men who were veterans of a dozen campaigns had to start again at the bottom and learn the techniques of this new kind of warfare. It was to here, too, that they returned in 1944 when their job in New Guinea was finished, to join with the reinforcements and train together for the last major campaign, Borneo. By April 1945, the war against Japan was drawing to a close. One of the last remaining tasks of the Australian troops was the capture of Tarakan, a small island off the coast of Borneo and the site of valuable oil refineries. It was an Allied combined operation, carried out with the full support of Allied naval and air forces. For the first time in the history of the war, the balance of strength was on our side. We had sufficient troops, well provided with the latest equipment, and the operation was planned by men with 3 years of experience in the island campaigns. Early on the morning of the 1st of May, and preceded by a severe bombardment from naval ships and strikes by aircraft, the landing on the beach at Tarakan commenced. The approaches were difficult. The Japanese had set many mines and obstacles on the beaches and further inland. At first, the progress of the infantry was slow. The interior of the island was hilly, and the enemy opposed them strongly with fire from well-concealed positions. The air was heavy with the smoke from the fired oil wells. Snipers were everywhere, and the commando squadron found it hard to expel the Japanese from Tarakan Hill. But by the end of the 5th of May, after 5 days of severe fighting, the hill was cleared and the town was ours. The invasion of Borneo itself had begun on the 10th of June, when the fight for Tarakan was entering its final stage. Strong resistance had been encountered at first, but eventually, harassed by ground and air attacks, the enemy began to withdraw.
As soon as we got the upper hand, it was just a question of mopping up and getting organized. Most of us found the boredom of all this pretty hard to take. It was then you started to worry about the family. The wife, sick of being married to a soldier. And the kids, who last time you saw them treated you so politely, like a great uncle or something. You wondered if it would ever come right again, when you got back.
Malaria. It had been one of the curses right through the island's campaign. The discovery of DDT had at last given us an effective weapon against it. We must have sprayed tons of it about. The local boys helped us. And the result was that in the Borneo campaign, malaria was no longer a danger. If only we could have done the same in the early days of New Guinea.
We'd liberated Borneo. And even though we'd never been better organized or better equipped, we still came out of it with men killed and others wounded. We were sick of the sight of dead and maimed bodies, and I think we were all wondering in the back of our minds just how much more we could take. We heard they were planning to invade Malaya next, and after that, Japan itself. Then the news of Hiroshima broke. 78,000 human beings, civilians, killed in one blow, and God knows how many wounded. And it was all over. Finished with one bomb. It made me wonder what the last 5 years had been for.
men came back, those who were left. Australians killed numbered 30,000. For those who did return, it would be hard to settle down to civilian life again, to take up where they left off. For some, perhaps, it would be especially hard. The Victory March of 1945 was a long time ago. We've all had a lot to do since then. And we've changed a lot, too. The emotions of the war years, the fears, the shocks, the sorrows have faded with time. And a new generation is growing up, to whom the war is as unreal as all events are that took place in that period called history, where things are done and forgotten. But the ones who were young that spring of '39, they can't forget.
Good morning, boys and girls.
The scars may not show, but many carry with them still the wounds caused by things seen and things done. The period of prosperity was won, but it cost a lot. From what they went through during the war, many men will never fully recover. The damage cannot be undone. Treat them with care.